If you've ever wanted to know more about how users find your website across multiple sessions before they take critical actions, such as filling out forms or placing purchases, then ListenLayer has a great solution with our user source listener. You can enable this listener and then jump to the features screen, and you can turn on a feature here called Capture User Source. What this will do is this will automatically identify where a user comes from when they begin a session on your website. And then it'll push that information into the data layer as structured data. Now, once it's in the data layer, it becomes extremely useful and powerful because you can do a lot of things with it inside of ListenLayer, such as store it in the browser or take more information out of the browser. But once you get that data layer structured the way you want, you can then use it to power tracking inside of Google Tag Manager. And you can do some other really cool things like actually capture information into form submissions. If you want to know more about the data layer in general, jump to the use cases page of ListenLayer and watch the data layer basics video. Now, once you enable this capture user source feature, this user source rules screen will appear. And when we navigate there, you'll see that we have two rule sets that are existing by default. Now you can create your own rule sets up here. And what that allows you to do is build additional rules to define what your traffic sources are, what your user sources are. Or you can actually just edit the rule sets that we have right here. Now the rule sets apply from top to bottom. And once a match is found, it'll stop looking for a value. So you can use multiple rule sets as well as the individual details inside of a rule set to actually manage how you want your logic to work. In this case here, you can see we have some detailed rules by default that determine the type of Google Ads traffic that came in. So for example, if you have a UTM source in your visitor, in your tracking URLs from Google Ads, and the value contains Google Display, we're going to return Google Ads Display. And as you run down these, what you'll find is kind of a little bit of a catch-all rule here, where if a Google Click ID exists with any value, then we're just going to return Google Ads. And so we have some more specific rules at the top and less specific rules down at the bottom. That's also pretty cool because you can change these values here, or you can leave them the same. And when you change the values, you can also actually insert other data layer variables into the user source information. So you could, for example, say, hey, I want to actually include my keyword when somebody comes from Google Ads. And the keyword is going to come from your UTM parameters. You're going to have a UTM underscore term. And you should be able to insert that because the user source listener will grab that information from the URL and it will parse that and make it available. Now, in order for that to appear here under my data layer variables, I would first have to publish my changes. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. We'll come back and we'll finish filling out our keywords. Now, before I publish, it's also important to note if you're brand new to ListenLayer, you need to make sure that your domain names are set up correctly under domains. And you need to make sure that your website script is installed and loading on every page of your website. And once you do that, you'll want to turn on a listener like this user source listener, along with some activity features, and then you'll want to publish it. So this is kind of my first user source release. And we're going to jump to our website, our test website here. And I'm going to have my console open just to make sure that we're loading the correct ListenLayer account. You can see this ListenLayer account ends in 35FF. I'm not seeing any errors inside of my ListenLayer information. And I can jump back here and I can see that this account ends in 35FF. So we're successfully loading the script. And we can look at my enabled listeners and see that I have the user source listener enabled. So now I should be getting some user source activity. So what does that actually look like? Well, the first thing I'd recommend doing is go ahead and let's clear our browser storage and clear our cookies, just so we can get kind of a fresh view of a visitor coming to our website here. And then I'm going to pretend like I'm coming in from a Google ad. So I'm going to formulate one of my URLs, and I'm going to include UTM term because this is the value that I want to capture and do something with. And so we're going to come in as if we're a new user. It looks like because I cleared my cookies, I got logged out here. But so as I log back in there, we'll notice in my console here that I have a user source event. So because ListenLayer has identified me as, just starting a new session, it looked for where I came from. And it determined based on this GCLID rule that I came from Google Ads. And what do you know? The actual keyword value that I had added in here under my user source rules is now appearing inside of my data layer. Now this data layer activity is just simply being written to the console, so that's easy to see. There's actually a data layer object that you can query here, and that will show you the same information, but we simply write it here because it's a little easier to see quickly and digest and see multiple events being pushed in. You can also use the Google Tag Manager debug view, and you can see I have a very similar view where I can see my gravity forms have loaded. This comes from ListenLayer. You can see my URL parameters listener is working and my user source listener. So this becomes pretty powerful because you can see here all of the information about my user source, including the actual traffic source right here, is being pushed into the data layer. So now that I have visited my website with UTM term, ListenLayer has also seen that. And if we jump back to my data layer activity, we'll notice that the URL query string is being parsed out. So we have URL query, and then we have our GCLID, which was up in our URL, and we have the search keyword. And so now ListenLayer knows, hey, I'm going to have this concept of a UTM term that I want to be able to do something with. It's going to appear in my data layer. And what that does is it makes this available under my variables. That is a data layer variable. So if I go to my automatic data layer variables here, which these exist inside of automatic values, I'm going to jump to URL, query. I'm just going to confirm that UTM term has already been registered in my system now since ListenLayer has seen this. And then I'm going to jump back to my user source rules. I'm going to re-edit this. And now I want to actually insert my keyword. So I'm going to search for UTM term. And what I want is this one right here, the url.query.utm term. Now, again, if you're not familiar with data layers, watch that data layer beginners video. And you'll learn a little bit more about this kind of dot notation. This is just a path to the variable that I want. So now I'm going to go ahead and save. And there's a bunch of other rules here. So notice that if I go further down my table, there's some rules for Facebook and some other things. And then if a rule is not found based on my URL parameters, what's going to apply are my referral rules. So let's say I come in from a google.com domain, but I haven't come in on a paid traffic kind of URL, then we know that it's now called Google Organic instead of Google Ads. You can insert new rules here. So for example, let's say you pay for traffic from Capterra.com, but you also get some organic traffic. So maybe your referrer here, Capterra.com, this is going to be Capterra Organic. But then we know that if we're buying an ad on that website, we're actually going to have a UTM source that's going to contain the value Capterra. Or maybe it's Capterra paid. So now I'm going to go ahead and save my changes just giving you guys a few different use cases of how you may want to customize your user source rules. And we're going to go ahead and publish this. Call this user source updates. And one thing to note is that whenever ListenLayer sees a user that comes in and they match a new traffic source or a new kind of user source, it resets their session. So the sessions operate slightly differently than just a straight time-based session. And what this allows you to do is if somebody sees you on LinkedIn, clicks on an ad, comes over to you, and then they search for you in Google organic, click on that organic listing, 2 hours later, we're actually going to kind of treat those as two different sessions because they originated from different places. Because really, we critically want to understand where people are coming from. So now I'm going to have, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to change my UTM source to that Capterra paid. And what that's going to do is it's going to kind of trigger a new user source here. You can see that we have a new user source. Now it's Capterra paid. It's just that rule that I just created. And we have Google Ads. Now I'm going to actually go back to this other URL. So I'm going to copy this value and just save that for a second from now. But what I wanted to kind of note here is if I just start navigating around, I'm not going to get my user source activity here because it's only being pushed into the data layer once per session. But again, if I change my traffic source, so in this case, I'm going to go back to my GCLID example. And I'm going to replace this with term again. Here is my keyword. And as long as everything's formulated there correctly, we're going to see that our latest user source now has been switched back to Google. And you can see my full keyword is now actually being inserted in this. So cool. Now we have this kind of event-based activity on our website where in real time as somebody interacts with our website, we know where they're coming from. So what do we do with this from this point forward? Well, the next logical thing to do is going to be to use this information and collect it over time and then recapture it at moments in time when important things occur on our website. So we're going to turn on this feature called custom data layer values. And we're going to turn on a feature called browser storage. And what we're going to do is as a user source is pushed into the data layer, we're actually going to store that in the browser so that it persists over time. You see, the data layer itself is only going to appear here once. It's going to show this information at a moment in time when an event occurs. If we want that in the future, we need to store it. So we're going to save it in the user's browser. And there's three ways we can do it. We can save it as local storage, session storage, or cookies. So we'll choose one of those. Once the value is saved, we can then use our custom data layer values to pull the value back out of that browser storage at some future point in time and push it back into the data layer. And actually, depending on your use case, you may not use this feature on this listener. Let's go ahead and turn that off. We may use the feature on a different listener like Gravity Forms. You can see we actually already have our custom values data layer feature turned on here. So let's jump back to user source, and we're going to create a rule to populate browser storage. Now, before we actually go create our rule, we need a place to store this. So we need to create our browser storage variables, and that's a global setting. You can see we have one created already to save my Facebook click ID. I'm going to create a new one called user source path. I'm going to create another one just for illustration purposes called user source first. And I'm going to create another one called user source last. Now, I'm going to go ahead and use local storage keys. The nice thing about local storage keys, they're going to tend to stick around a little bit longer than cookies in some browsers in this day and age, but they can't interact with your server side stuff, right? But it's enough for what we need to do with ListenLayer. We can pull stuff out of local storage using ListenLayer. easy enough. Now, the downside of local storage is that if you are using multiple subdomains on a website and people are crossing those subdomains, you're not necessarily going to carry the local storage information from one subdomain to another. And so that can be a downside where you might want to use cookies. You're most likely not going to be using session storage because anything stored in the session storage will disappear when the user's session ends, or essentially when they kind of close the tab to your website. So we have a path key, we have a first, and we have a last. We're going to save those and jump back to browser storage. We're going to create a rule. We're going to select local storage, and we're going to say store user source. You can add a description, of course. And we need to write a condition. So what I'm going to say is every time the user source event is true in my data layer, I want to do something. And what I want to do is I want to set the value of those 3 browser storage keys that I just created. The first one is my path. The second one is my first, and the third one is my last. Now, why we have these different 3 keys is because we're going to do something different. This one, we're going to add the new value to the existing value using a comma delimited structure. So we're never going to lose the historical value unless, of course, the user totally clears their local storage, which is going to be rare. This other one, we always want to keep the first value. So we're never going to overwrite any existing value. And the last one here, we're going to keep the last value. So we're always going to overwrite an existing value. So you see, we're going to have a path. Let's say the visitor comes to our site, has 5 different sessions from 5 different user sources. We're going to store that in local storage as a list. Here, we're just going to keep the first one, and here we're going to keep the last one. Now, we need to decide what we're going to do to set the value. What are we going to push into this value? And it's actually going to be the user source itself. So we want to get this value from our data layer, and we want to store it into the browser. So one easy way to do that is we can just copy the property path to this source variable. It's this data layer variable. And again, this goes back to that kind of dot notation. And so you can go to that data layer basics video and look at that a little bit. But we are just going to be looking for the source. It should end in dot source, just like this. Of course, there's a bunch of other stuff because of source location, but this is the one we're looking for. You can see it's generated this variable, which is just a reference to this thing in the data layer. And we're going to put that in all of these. And then we're going to save the rule. Now, remember, ListenLayer sees these things like source and source location and URL, and then registers them in the system. So the reason that list existed, that I could select those variables from, is because ListenLayer has seen those variables. And that variable that we were just looking at is this. Now, if you want, you could give this a friendly name, which is just for the back end. And what that does is sometimes make it a little bit easier to find. So if I go back to my browser storage and I jump to my last step here, instead of looking for this crazy, that crazy long kind of path, I can go ahead and just search this for user source. And now I have kind of a friendly name that makes it a little easier to find. It's just a quick tip there. So now we're going to go ahead and publish this. We're going to call this browser storage. And so now every time I get that, a change here in my browser storage or in my user source, I'm going to store it in the browser. Now remember, I just implemented this, so I'm not going to get the activity from previous. And actually, I probably should have done a hard refresh. It might not come through without doing a hard refresh. So let's just look here. And it did work. So we have user source first, we have path, and last. Now they're all going to equal Facebook ads because I just visited with a Facebook click ID. So see, I had my user source event, put that in here. Now let's switch back to Google Ads as if we kind of came from a new traffic source. We're going to get another data layer event populating here. And go back to here, and we'll see that now our latest or our last is Google Ads, and our first one is Facebook. So now this is cool. Now I can start to see, hey, how's this user interacted with my website, and where did they come from before they did something important? So let's just throw one more value in here. Let's use that Capterra value as just an example. And we'll see we immediately have some updates here to our browser storage information. So pretty cool. Now we're kind of collecting some information about this user as they interact with our website, so we can know a little bit more about what's going on. So now the users, now the question is, what do we want to do with this? Well, let's say somebody starts a chat. We probably want to capture this. Or let's say they fill out a form. We want to capture this. There's two ways to capture this that we're going to illustrate. We're going to use Gravity Forms as an example. The first way is to use custom data layer values. We're going to take the value out of browser storage and we're going to push it back into the data layer. The second way is we can actually populate hidden fields on a form and we can save it when the form is submitted. So let's just jump back up here and we're going to go to our custom data layer variables because I need to define those things first. And we're going to create 3 of them. And they're going to be these user source variables. I'm just going to name them to match my local storage keys. And go ahead and save that. Now these are available for me to push some information into the data layer, against these variable names. So I'm going to go back to custom values and I'm going to write a rule to say, hey, when something happens with my Gravity Forms, I want to do something. I want to push some value into those variables. I'm going to just do a simple rule that should work fine. And this is going to be the rule to get user source from browser storage. And I want this to happen when my Gravity Forms load on a page or when my Gravity Forms are submitted. Now the submission one is the one that I really care about. When a form is submitted, I want to get that information from the data layer. I'm going to go ahead and enable it also for Gravity Forms loaded because it just makes it a little easier to debug and I can see what's going on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the value of a custom variable in my data layer. We're going to set the value of path and we're going to get it from browser storage. We're going to get the path value. This is a reference to this right here that we created under local storage. And we're going to get first and we're going to get last. So now when this condition is met, we're going to actually get the values out of browser storage and we're going to put them back in the data layer. And again, the really powerful thing about this is now local storage can be available at a moment in time when an important event occurs and I can do something with that in Google Tag Manager. And this is going to work like clockwork, right? If I just publish this and do a hard refresh, so I'm going to say this is Populate Fields for Gravity Forms. Let's do a quick hard refresh. What we're going to see is our Gravity Forms are going to load on the page. We're going to get that data layer activity and you're going to see in our custom values, user source first, user source last, user source path. Pretty cool. So now when this form is actually submitted, we could have an event inside of GTM or a trigger inside of GTM that looks at this event name, GF form loaded, or actually looks for this next event name, which is the Gravity Form submitted. And when that's submitted, like I just did there, GTM, we can register these variables inside of GTM. And GTM will get these. And then we could do something like send them to a Google Sheet or send it to Zapier. We'll have a direct Zapier integration on our roadmap here soon. So you could eventually just do that based on events and data layer activity directly out of ListenLayer's application. But being able to do it directly in Google Tag Manager is obviously extremely powerful. You can send this information as secondary source information into somewhere like GA4 when conversions happen. In addition to that, though, you can populate fields and keep it alongside your data, which we'll look at in a minute. Another use case, which is maybe a little bit more advanced, is if you have a chat tool, it's a little bit harder to send the data into your chat tool oftentimes. So what you can do is when the chat activity occurs, like a chat starts and we'll push that data into the data layer, we might give you like a chat ID, which is the identifier from your chat tool of what that conversation ID is. And then you could capture this information along with that ID, maybe store it in a Google Sheet, like I said, and then you can literally merge that into your CRM system. For example, you could use Zapier to then add it into a record a few minutes after that that activity has occurred and made its way into a Google Sheet. So let's jump to Populate Fields. Now, what this is going to allow us to do is take information from the browser and actually push it into a hidden field inside of Gravity Forms. So the first step, we're gonna jump into Gravity Forms. Actually, we're gonna jump back to here, and I just want to look at the two forms that we have. We're gonna try it on two different forms. We have this Gravity Form number 2 on this page, and we have Gravity Form number 4. So let's go to our forms. We'll close these out. And I may have gotten logged out from clearing my cache. No, okay, I'm good. So we want Gravity 2 and 4. I'll open 4 first. Or sorry, I'll open 2 first, and I'll open 4. And you'll notice that I've already kind of pre-prepped this. I have some hidden fields on my forms that I've created. Now, the thing to note is that when I add a hidden field like user source first to this form, and then I add the same field to this form, oftentimes they're actually a different field, especially when they're output on the front of the website. So user source first here is field ID number 7 on Gravity Form number 2. And user source first here is field ID number 8 on Gravity Form 4. So you can see we have a potential problem here because we want to write a single rule that's going to take a value from our local storage and we're going to push it into any form that has this user source first field. But this user source first field is kind of a different field on these different forms. Now, this is only an issue on some form systems. Other form systems like HubSpot or Marketo, I think are a little bit better at handling this where you'll actually have like a centralized field and it can be easily identified. And the question is really comes down to, can you identify this field inside of the code of your website? And this could be a little bit of a challenge if you're not totally familiar with this. I tend to put my hidden fields at the top of my forms because they're easier to see. So you can see on my first form here, I just scrolled up to the list items. I can see my input is inside this list item. So don't get too frustrated if you're looking through your code. Ask our support team if you need some help. But generally, if you look at these a few times, you'll start to catch on to it. And what you'll see here is this user source first field. There's an input here, and it's input 7. But then if I go down to this form and I scroll up to my second field, I have user source first. I'll open up my div tag, and this is input 8. Now, ListenLayer is going to look at this input name and the ID to identify this field. That's the only way we can kind of like definitively determine automatically that, hey, there's a field, we can do something with it, and this is how we identify it. So the question is, how do we allow ListenLayer to treat these fields as the same thing, even though they're kind of different? And the answer is just slightly advanced beyond basic, but all we're doing is we're going to add what's called a class to our field. And you can see I've already done it. User source underscore first has been added in this class up here. And if I were to look at my other field, which I'll look at in a second, it's going to have the same value. Let's jump to the back of our site, and we're going to edit this user source first. We're going to check out appearance, and this is where that's coming from. Most form tools at the field level will allow you to add a value into the CSS class. And maybe there's already a value here, like, some existing value. Literally just put a space and put your new value in there. And that'll work just fine. That existing value might be used for actually styling the field, and just put yours at the end of it. It should work okay. And we're going to take this exact same value, and on our other forms, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to add that user source first. So now what that's going to do is allow me to write a rule that's going to say, hey, ListenLayer, target any fields that are inside of something that has this class, and then populate that with my information. Now, of course, we're going to have to do this for last. So you can see I have user source last and path, user source path. And I'll double check these ones, user source path, user source last. So these are individual things, individual identifiers on a per field basis. But essentially what I've done is I've unified my actual fields. So of course you want to check that on your forms. Make sure that on the front of the site, if I go back up to this form and I go back up to this list item that wraps my field, you can see user source first is up here also. Now, this is interesting because Gravity Forms puts this class way up here on this list element. And then we have a div element, and then we have our input. And there's a div kind of in between also. Don't worry about that. Your form system might be different. You might have a p tag or a span tag or something else, or maybe it puts the class directly on the input. It's just different on different systems. So what we do is we allow you to identify an HTML element based on the existence of the CSS, and then we'll look for any inputs inside of that. And we're going to populate those with information. Cool. So let's jump back to Gravity Forms. We're going to create a rule under Populate Fields. We're going to push our user source into hidden fields. And again, what we're going to do is when our form loads on the page, we're going to populate that. We're going to keep it super simple. And think about it this way. When the form is submitted, it's kind of too late to populate the field unless you really do things in a great way. So simplify it and just realize that like when the form loads, that's when you're going to want to populate the information. Now this is a data layer event that's occurring. So there are some weird use cases where the form will actually load before you have the information that you want to populate stored in the local storage. And so what happens is this condition actually just kind of triggers the population of the fields. And then we loop the population of the fields for a bit until we find a value in the local storage key. And what we're going to do is we're going to look for a local storage key and we're going to populate that into a field. And let's focus on user source first instead of selecting from a dropdown, because remember the input is 7 on one form and 8 on another. And you could really get messed up. There's no way if you had 5 forms or all of a sudden you add a new form and it has a different input ID for the GCL ID. So instead of selecting from the dropdown, we're going to use this thing called the Css Attribute Selector. And we're going to put in the value that we added in to our field, user source last in that case. Now I'm going to change this one to user source first because I know that is one of them. And I put this on the class, not the ID. So I'm going to prefix this with a period. Now, there's a video you can watch here to learn a little bit more about these. If you need some more advanced cases of CSS selectors, can't figure it out, ask our dev team or ask our support team, and our dev team will get back to you on some cool ways that you can match something. Now we need to get the name of our browser storage key. So the first is being stored. Let's go back to our application. I don't remember it off the top of my head. It's the user source first. Okay. So I'm just going to copy this. So this is the key name, and I'm going to be getting that key. Notice I can just freeform define this because I want to be able to get anything, even if it's created by another system. And I'm going to put it into this field. Then I'm going to create 2 more of these. So I'm going to do path, and I'm going to do last. And then here, I'm going to use my CSS selector rules again. And I'm going to throw these in there, but I'm just going to update this. Path and last. So now when my condition is met, ListenLayer is going to attempt to populate those fields. Save it, and I'm going to go ahead and publish. Populate GF. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just refresh this with a hard refresh. Take a look at my console, get my Gravity Form loaded information. Should work pretty quickly. You can see our custom data layer values. Previous to this, when we had written the custom values rule, that's still showing up here. But our automatic values is where we're going to see our form fields. So let's see if everything has worked. and it has worked. Check this out. So we have inputs 7, 8, and 9. These are my fields, and they have values in them. This one is Facebook. This one is Capterra. This one is Facebook, comma, Google Ads. My keyword, I have an extra space at the end of this, so I'd want to clean that up. In my user source rules back up here. And then Capterra paid. So these are actually being populated into the fields. Now, there's an interesting scenario where some form systems, if you actually look in the code, you're not going to see the values being populated there. So let's, what was I searching for? User source first. Let's just find my field. It's going to be inside this div. And you'll see, interesting, the value is empty over here. But in my console, my data layer is actually, my data layer listener is actually seeing the value there, but I'm not visually seeing it in my source code. So just, there's an interesting use case there where the value is here. You just can't see it. And you'll want to check your console and see if it's here inside of your fields. There's a, you can actually query that field and you can see what the value is here in the console as well. But if you're having issues and you can't get past that point and you need some help, there's two things you should do. First, test it. Fill out a form and see if you get the values in the back of the system. And second, you can always reach out to our support team and we will get back to you. So let's go ahead and fill this out and make sure I know which one I just submitted. That was form 2. I'm going to check those automatic values again on the submission event. And I can see my values are populated again. So again, that's another thing you can do is you can actually go through and submit the form and check it here. You can also check it back here. So I'm going to go to my entries on form 2 and you can see now I have this new entry. And check this out. I got a Facebook click ID because that was something I was already capturing. I got the user source first. I got the user source last. I got the path. So now along with every lead that I collect, I can see where they're coming from. Super cool. Super cool data. And again, you're also getting this directly in the data layer. So you can do something with it out of the data layer using Google Tag Manager. Really, the sky is the limit. You can do almost anything inside of ListenLayer, anything that you can imagine. Just get in there, start using the features, send us questions, send us ideas for new listeners, and we'd love to help you out.